Welcome back, everybody, to another JavaScript Office API tutorial. In today's video, we're going to be covering our first object of the Excel object model inside of the JavaScript Office API. And we're going to start basically at the highest level we can go. I mean, technically we can go a little bit higher, but we're going to start with the Workbook Object. So we're going to be working with an Excel Workbook object inside of the JavaScript Office API. And we're just going to do some basic things, being able to access some new built-in components like get the active chart, get a pivot table. We're going to work with some of the workbook properties, things like the name, things like, the number of sheets that are in a particular workbook. And then we're also going to see how to loop through all the worksheets in the workbook. So very useful stuff, kind of the basic stuff that we need in order to kind of get running. What I'm going to do first, actually, if everyone could, please let me know if you can read that at this font. I know it might be a little hard, but this is, again, I'm assuming people can read it. If you can't, please let me know and I'll increase the font size. I'm probably not going to go too much bigger than that, though, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to write. I hope over time they kind of develop and integrate this add-in more. I think it's really useful, but you can still kind of tell it's in development. Some things kind of crash randomly. Alrighty, so I got a workbook that I have currently open. As you can tell, there is a table inside of this workbook. This is leveraging one of Excel's new feature. If you go to data, it's one of the data types feature. And so here are some stocks that I've selected, and then I've pulled some information in this particular stock. And then basically what I'm doing is I just have two other sheets, one where it creates a pivot table and then another one where it creates a chart. And so we're going to see how to work with these basic objects, more of just selecting and doing a couple different properties, but enough to hopefully, get us started. So the first thing that we always do when we start coding in JavaScript is we define a function where we want to put all of our statements related to our particular task at hand. So remember in my last video, well, I don't know if it was my last video, but I was talking about how we can kind of jump over from VBA and think about the structure. Inside of VBA, we had subroutines or function routines. In this particular program language, we're just going to have regular functions, and we can have either async functions or non-async functions. Now, for the most part, you will always be seeing me do async functions unless for one particular reason we need to do it the other way around. So the way that we think about an async function is kind of like a subroutine. So it's very easy to create. We just do async function, and then we just give the function a name. I'll give it something like Workbook Object. We then put two brackets, and then we open up our function by doing two squirrely brackets. Very important stuff that we do this. So everything we want needs to now be inside these two little squirrely brackets, just like that. So from here, now we can start writing our code. The first line that you will almost always write is await excel.run. And so this is a method that belongs to our Excel object. And then again, we give it the keyword async, and then we pass through some parameter name, which is usually by default the context. A little bit of an overview of what's kind of going on here. When we call the Excel object and then the run method, we are basically saying, hey, we have some lines of code that we want to run against our Excel object model. And so by using the await keyword, what we're saying is make sure to run all of the statements that belong to this particular function before you move on to the next one. And then inside my run function, I'm saying I'm using the async keyword to say that somewhere in my function, I'm going to be using the await keyword in order to basically do things like load the properties, do things like making sure things sync before we actually move on to, in some cases, printing them out. So just keep that in mind. It might sound confusing at first, but I do have a video that covers this topic if you're still a little bit confused. But over time, you'll kind of get it, and then it'll make a little bit more sense. And then we put our equal brackets, and then then we put everything that we want to be inside of this function. So this is now inside of our run function that belongs to our Excel application. So it's a little bit confusing at first, but it's a function within a function, right? Confusing? Yeah, a little bit, not too bad. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to grab the workbook. And so we're going to create a new variable. There's a couple of different ways we can create a variable. We have either the constant keyword, we have let, and we have var. A lot of people don't like var because the scoping issues that belong to it are just can get you into trouble, because when you define something as var, you can technically access this variable outside of the function. And so we don't want that most of the time. So usually what people will do is they'll either use let or constant. Let is basically a variable that you're saying, hey, it could change potentially the value of it. Constant means you're defining a variable that you were not expecting to change. So in my particular function right now, I'm going to define a new variable using constant, and I'm going to call it Excel Workbook, because I'm expecting that this workbook is not going to be changing. I'm not going to be changing the workbook that I'm working with in my Excel application at this point. It's just going to be the one that I'm working out of currently. So I'm going to do context and then call the workbook property. So the workbook property exists in our context object. This is basically our runtime environment that we're using Excel in. So that's how you need to think about the context. It's just the runtime environment. Inside that runtime environment, there is a property called workbook, which returns the workbook that we are currently working out of. I'm going to move, well, no, I'm actually on the right sheet, so I'm fine. And then from here, I am going to grab a particular chart. So I'm going to say grab the active chart. That's usually the one that is selected. Again, this will stay constant. I'm going to do Excel chart, and then that will equal the Excel workbook. And then there's a method called getActiveChart. This returns a chart object. If it's a method, we put brackets at the end, and then we finish it off with a semicolon. Make sure you're putting your semicolons at the end of each line of your code. It's very important that you do that for syntax purposes. Okay, so if I select this, of course, something broke. What happened? Oh, I think it's because I didn't put this. Sometimes it doesn't. No? Type error. Oh, that's why, because I didn't put my function that I'm using. So, sorry about that. We're going to assign this function to this button. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass through the workbook object function, and it's going to be wrapped by this try catch function. And this basically is just our error catcher. That's how I like to think about it. So if there's an error, it console logs that error. Otherwise, it just does whatever it was supposed to be doing to begin. So again, we're defining the button using the element ID. We're assigning a click event to it, and then we're putting basically we're assigning the workbook object function to that click event. And so when I run it like that, it's fine. If you don't run it like that, so if you don't have the chart selected, you will get an error. So the getActiveChart does expect it to have something where, let me see if that works again. If it does expect you to have the chart selected, and then sometimes you do have to clear your console log. It doesn't automatically clear it. So again, if you don't have it selected, you get an error. But if you do have it selected, you will not get that error. So that's very important to understand about this particular method, is it does expect you to have that particular chart selected. So now that you have it selected, let's load some properties about that particular chart. Okay, so we now have the chart, so load some properties about that chart. Load some properties. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my Excel chart object. It has a method called load, and then I'm going to pass through a list of strings where each string is simply a unique property. So there is a name property that belongs to our chart. There is a chart type. Where is it? Chart type. And then there is also an ID. So these are three unique properties that belong to our chart. If you're ever curious and saying, hey, what what are the properties? You can always just type it up like that. And then again, the ones that are kind of the blue little bricks are properties. If they're a purple cube, they are a method. So there's things like data labels, ID, left, legend. Keep in mind, some of these properties return other objects. So if you try printing them, it's just going to give you this generic object. It's not going to actually have anything associated with it. So it's very important you understand that. So now that we've loaded our properties, we need to sync it. So we need to sync it with our runtime environment. And so what we're going to do is sync the properties. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to call my await keyword because I want to make sure that this finishes before we go to the next line. I'm going to call my context object, and then I'm going to do sync. I'm going to call the sync method, and then I'm going to put my semicolon, just like that. And now we can print the results. And so maybe I want to print, I do backward slash because we're going to be inserting something. The chart name is, and then we put our $sign, squirrely brackets. Whoa. That's how to get yourself confused. You call the object and name, and then you call the property that you want to print. And then I just copy this a couple times. And again, each one of these needs to have a semicolon at the end. And so we'll do this one as the chart type. And then we will do this one as the ID. Just like that. And we'll say the chart type is, and the chart ID is. So let's run it and see what we get. Perfect. So we get the chart name is chart1, the chart type is a line chart, and then we get the chart ID is this fancy little ID right there. So just to kind of recap a little bit, we define a function, and then inside that function we call our Excel object and we run certain statements against the Excel object model. We then declared a couple variables. One of them is the actual workbook itself that lives inside our context object, and then we have our chart. Now inside our workbook there is something called getActiveChart method that returns the active chart you have selected. Once you've defined that active chart, you can then play around with some of the properties by calling the chart object, then the load method, and then you just pass through the properties that you want to work with. Now just because you've actually written this line doesn't mean it's been executed. And so what you do is you say, okay, take your context runtime environment, sync all your loads, and then you print the properties. Very, very important that you do this line right here. Because if you don't, just as a reminder, you get all these little errors. And it's saying, wait a minute, you didn't sync any of your loads. You got to make sure you sync your loads before you start printing them. And then again, we have our little button called run. We are assigning a click event to it, and we're saying, hey, for that click event, simply put the workbook object function associated with it. So when you run this, when you click this button, you run this function, and then we have our try catch function that basically is our generic error handler. Okay, so that's with a chart. Let's see what it would look like with a pivot table, right? We've done a chart, let's do a pivot table. So let's grab the pivot table. Again, it's going to be a constant. I am not expecting my pivot table to change in my workbook at this point. Going forward, that's definitely not going to be the case sometimes. There are some times where, guess what? Your pivot table will be changing on different sheets all the time. So I'm going to call my workbook. I'm going to go into the pivot tables collection. Now, just for sanity's sake, there is, well, they have a get active chart and stuff like that, but they don't actually have the chart collection, but they do have a pivot tables collection that lives at the workbook level. And then so you call the pivot tables collection, and then you call the get item method, and then you pass through the key, or just the name for pivot table in this case. You pass through the key for the pivot table that you want. Well, this is simply called pivot table 1. And we can already see why having this add-in might be problematic sometimes, because it takes up a lot of real estate. and it makes it a little bit complicated to see certain things. But anywho, there is a pivot table, and we're going to select that pivot table, and then from here, let's again load some properties. So load some properties. And so we will take our pivot table object. Again, we'll call the load method, and then we'll just put through a list. We'll put through the name. And then in this case, I will put through an object, and I'll show you kind of what you would expect if you see that. I'm hoping to God I'm spelling this right. Yeah, I think that's right. I'm looking at my notes and I'm like, I can't really see that. It's hard. Okay, but keep in mind before you actually run this little line of code, you do need to comment out the components with the chart, because the first thing you're going to notice is it's going to give you an error because you're no longer on the sheet that has the chart. So you just got to keep that in mind. Shortcut to multi-line comment is Control-KC if you're on a Windows. I had to think about that one for a second. So I'm just, again, taking an object, I'm loading some of the properties, I'm syncing that load, and then I can actually start, printing stuff. So then we'll print the results. Fun stuff. So we'll do console.log. I need my backward bracket. The pivot table name is $, squirrely brackets, Excel pivot table dot name, just like that. I'm going to copy that. Also, as a note, I don't know if I mentioned this, the reason I'm doing the backwards bracket like this, so I think that's called like a tilde. Is that tilde? I think it's tilde. Is because I'm basically saying, hey, this string, I'm planning to insert some component to it. So I'm inserting another string within it. So this is just defining a string that you're planning to insert something in. So that's what the tildes do. And then pivot table data something, I don't know. We'll just call it data. I could really care about the naming convention at this point. Okay, and then we'll see what this returns. I am expecting just a generic object. Okay, so the pivot table name is pivot table 1. That's pretty self-explanatory. The pivot table data is object. So basically this is just saying we're currently printing out an object. So this particular property returns an object. I'm not here to talk about pivot tables yet, but just so you know, if you start seeing stuff like that, you're using a property that's returning an object. So that's why you're seeing things differently. So if you see object, it means you've used a property, or you've taken something like this and you're printing it, and you're basically printing an object. You can't print well, you can print an object, but there's nothing to print about. It's just going to give you this generic object name. So just for you guys to understand when you're going to start seeing that. Okay, so let's create a new function. I'm excited. I want to create a new function. So we'll just do kind of what we were doing up here. We'll just create an async function. But in this example, I want to work with the worksheets collection. So we'll do async function, and then we'll give it something like my worksheet collection. Well, I could call it cool. That would be kind of fun in its own little world. You want to put your squirrely brackets, and then you don't want to do what I did, which is skipped over the circular brackets. And then pretty much exactly the same, we're going to do await excel.run, and then we're going to use async because, again, we're telling TypeScript we're planning to use the await keyword inside of this function. And then we define the context object itself. And then we'll put our little equal sign, we'll put our parameter, and then we will put our squirrely brackets. We want to make sure that we close off that one, and then we can get going. Just as a reminder, I'm going to say it a couple times because I know it's new for everyone. This is the Excel object itself. This is the run method. You're saying you're running some code that is going to be used against the Excel object model. That's all you got to know at this point. In fact, if you hover over it, you're just using the namespace Excel. So kind of like the library in a sense, if you want to think about it. It's really sad though they don't have what is it? PowerPoint yet. I love PowerPoint and I can't work on it. It's so sad. But in time, we're going to grab the workbook first. Again, we're going to use constant. I'm not expecting my workbook to change. I'm going to do my context object. You can see right here, the Excel.request context. If you click that little thing, it tells you kind of a little bit what it is. And then you can do workbook. This is a property. It returns a workbook object. We put our semicolon, and then we go down just one more, and now we're going to define the worksheets collection. And here, again, it's going to be constant Excel worksheets, and then we're going to take our Excel workbook, and then we're going to do the worksheets collection. So this is returning the worksheets collection. Again, if I highlight it, it does give me a little bit of a definition. Represents a collection of worksheets associated with the workbook, read only. That's fine for this point. And then here it's telling, okay, Excel.workbook worksheets, Excel worksheet collection. So it's just telling you it's an object that it's returning, that's all. Okay, so now that you've done that, let's load some properties about our particular workbooks. Well, sorry, not workbook, worksheets. So define the properties we want to load. Now, there is a little bit of a trick that you can do with this. Well, yeah, that's fine. That should be fine for right now. We'll do load, put our brackets in. This is going to be for some of the workbook properties we're going to be working with. So we're going to do the workbook first. And what I'm going to say is there's certain properties that exist about my workbook. I'm just going to load all of them. I'm going to load the properties. This is going to be tongue twister. I'm going to load the properties property and then all of the children's properties that belong to the properties property. If that wasn't confusing enough, I really don't know what is. But yes, there is a property called properties, just to make things confusing. All right, so this is related to our workbook. And then we're going to load some properties that are related to our worksheet. So again, define the properties we want to load. And we're going to do Excel worksheets. We're going to do load. We're going to do that. And just as a note too, technically with this one, I don't need a list. I can just put in a string like that. A list or a string, again, it's up to you how you want to do it, but you don't technically have to do a list. We're going to do the name. I want the name of my worksheet. I want the items. This is going to be for iteration purposes. And then I want the ID. Okay, that's cool. And then to demonstrate two different types of loops, I do have to get the number of worksheets that I currently have. So we do that by getting the count. So get the count. Thing that you will need to know about this particular method is this requires a sync. It's kind of like load, but well, is whatever. Okay, this one I'm going to be using let. So I'm going to say let worksheets, worksheet count equal Excel worksheets, and then we're going to call the get count method. Why did I use let in this example? Well, while this doesn't seem to really change for the most part in our program, this can constantly change. This can constantly change, and more importantly, I might be reassigning something to it. This can constantly change, and I could see myself playing around with it where I add one to it, add two to it, whatever it is. So it kind of makes sense to say this potentially could be changing. So I'm going to use the let keyword to denote that, hey, this is a variable that I might be reassigning somewhere down my code. Now, I'm not going to, but that is an opportunity where more than likely I would change that one. This I'm probably not going to change as long as my stuff is in the same workbook. So this one makes sense to use constant. This one, on the other hand, I could see where that changes. So, that makes sense. Okay, so sync the loads and the counts. So we're going to say await context or a context object, and we're going to do sync. So sync everything. Then we can go through and do the fun stuff. So the first type of loop we're going to do is kind of like a for each loop. So we're going to say loop through the worksheets using a quote unquote for each loop. Now it's not identical to VBA, but it's pretty darn close. So we're going to say for brackets, let I in Excel worksheets, and we're going to call the items property. We're then going to put our squirrely brackets, and we're going to say console.log Excel worksheets dot items. We're going to put a square bracket I dot name. Bam, just like that. So let's take a look back. I'm looping through all the items in my worksheets collection. That is why I loaded the items property up here, because I'm using it in my loop. And then I'm going to print out each one of them, their name. So again, that's why I loaded this one. This is a for each. For, and then let I in. So I in is for each, I in. And then we have to define that variable. Well, you can't really do that, so that's where it gives you errors. What you can do is let. Sometimes you'll see var. Sometimes you'll see constant. For the most part, I let it be let. And again, so you're saying for each item in the worksheets collections items, go through and print the name. So if I run this, I first need to change the function that is assigned to my button. So I'm going to copy my function name, and I'm going to put it right up here. I'm going to run it. Chart, pivot table, table. Works wonderfully. Let's look at the next type loop, which would be a regular for loop. So loop through the worksheets using a for loop. All right, so this one's going to be a little bit longer, but we're going to say for let I equal 0, semicolon, I is less than worksheet count dot value, and we're going to increment by 1 in our loop. So plus plus. Whoa, I don't think it was supposed to do that. Okay, and then from here, console.log Excel worksheets items I, and then we'll do the ID. Okay, so let's see what we have here. So for the most part, it's relatively the same. The structure is the same. We're defining our starting point. We're defining our ending point. So keep going up until you get to this point. Increment by 1, and then print out the ID. That's all. Let's see what we get. So you can see chart, pivot table, table, and then we have each ID that is printed out for each one of our sheets. So pretty useful at this point. You've now seen 2 basic loops, a for loop and a for each loop. We'll be taking more time to cover that because it is an important syntax thing, and I know some people coming over from VBA, it's going to be a little bit confusing. I know it was for me when I was first doing it. But at this point, this is kind of like your for each loop. This is your for loop. With the for loop, you define a starting point, you define an ending point, you define an incrementer. With a for loop, you just simply say, what is the collection I'm looping through? And then for each one of those objects, just go in here. But do notice, back in VBA, a little bit different. We just said for each item in my collection, and I could just print that item.name. Here, I have to go into the collection, call the items property, specify the item I want, and then call the property that I want for that particular item. So it's a little bit longer, but it's doable. And I'll keep researching and see if there's a better way to do that. But at this point, I kind of really haven't found anything. So I'm assuming that's kind of our way to do it. Alrighty, let's just do a couple final things, which is just print some properties about our workbook. Some of these, I will just give you a forewarning. They do give you errors. I'm not going to be actually printing them, but I will kind of mention them. So we'll say Excel Workbook properties. So the properties property. This is some of the document stuff. So properties tab. And then I want last author. I hope it's me. If it's somebody else, it's kind of scary because that means someone hacked my computer, which I don't want to think about. And we'll do one final one, which is creation date. So basically with this one, I took my workbook and I loaded the properties property and all of the children's, all the children that belong to the properties property. Again, confusing, I know. So we'll run it again. I printed out that you can see the author is me, and then you can see the creation date time. Keep in mind, I don't know why it does it. I'm still looking into it. It's not clear. But for example, if I do title, this one is supposed to be returning a string. For whatever reason, when I run this happens. And so you have to actually, so when this happens, you actually have to close out your run pane and then you have to open it again to fix it. I haven't been able to see a way to where you can refresh it, but certain properties have given me that error. So I'm going to keep exploring. If I think it's an actual bug issue, then I'll probably be submitting it on GitHub and hopefully they can fix it at some point. Again, this is still in development, so they're definitely trying to keep an eye out for bugs, but they can't find all of them sometimes. So we have to kind of help out at the same time. But yeah, with that being said, that pretty much does this video. Again, this was kind of our introduction to our first object, the workbook object. So we saw how to get a chart, we saw how to get a pivot table, load properties that are related to that particular object. And then we also saw how to loop through all the worksheets in our particular workbook. I will be sharing this on GitHub. I have a finished product. So I'm going to go to my little snippets and I got the workbook object. And you will find all of this here at the little thing. Where is it again? Oh yeah, update. No, is it there? Copy to clipboard. Is that how I'm supposed to do it? Don't look at my soda can. Oh no, that's just that's just doing the snippet. How do I get there again? No. I know I had it. Where is it? New public gist. Did I not? Oh, maybe I didn't publish this one yet. Okay, well, I just published it, so congratulations. I thought I published it. So yeah, this is basically what's going to do. So I'll be putting the links down in the video descriptions, but it's just a URL, and it does have all the code, so you can import it easily into your system. I encourage you to do that. That way you have code that at least works for the most part, and that way you can kind of expand upon it and then stuff like that. So I will be posting that. I've already posted a couple, but that was the first one that I think you just saw me load. So definitely useful stuff. But with that being said, if you have any questions, please put them down in the comments below. Again, I know it's a new object. There's not a lot we can do with these particular objects yet, but they are constantly adding to them, and over time we'll see that it's going to be the same as VBA and probably better. So exciting stuff to come. Also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And if you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates. Thanks again for watching, everybody. We will see you in the next video.